Hello and welcome to our viewers here in the United States and around the world. I'm Casey Hunt, live in Washington. We begin with the major win tonight for Democrats. CNN projects Senator Raphael Warnock will win re-election in that very close runoff election against Herschel Walker. The race closes out a difficult midterm cycle for Republicans who did win a slim majority in the House. But after tonight, they've lost ground in the Senate. Warnock's victory gives Democrats a 51-49 edge. It is a critical seat because it gives them a majority in all the Senate committees, and it limits the influence of any single moderate Democrat. They have, at times, held up President Biden's agenda. Senator Warnock spoke with supporters at his campaign headquarters in Atlanta a short time ago. He said he was honored to repeat the four most important words that he says were ever uttered in a democracy: the people have spoken.
I want to say thank you to my mother, who is here tonight. You'll see her in a little while. But she grew up in the 1950s in Waycross, Georgia, picking somebody else's cotton and somebody else's tobacco. But tonight, she helped pick her youngest son to be a United States Senator.
Never a bad plan to thank your mom. Herschel Walker conceded defeat in a short speech at his campaign headquarters in Atlanta about an hour ago. He thanked his supporters and pledged that he would continue to work for the voters of Georgia.
One of the things I want to tell all of you is you never stop dreaming. I don't want any of you to stop dreaming. I don't want any of you to stop believing in America. I want you to believe in America and continue to believe in the Constitution and believe in our elected officials most of all. Continue to pray for them, because all the prayers you've given me, I felt those prayers. I want to thank all my team as well, Team Herschel, because they put up with a lot. I want to thank Team Herschel. Thank all my donors as well, because you guys, without you, I couldn't have done what I've done. So I want to thank all of you as well, because there's no excuses in life. And I'm not going to make any excuses now, because we put up one heck of a fight.
It's going to be a lot to chew on there. We're going to talk about it with our great panel in just a second. But first, I want to get straight to CNN political director David Chalian, who is at the magic wall for us. David, help us understand what unfolded tonight and what it has taught us about the voters of Georgia and the state of the country.
Yeah, and where it leaves us, Casey, as you noted, this is the Senate now that America wakes up to this morning. A new balance of power, 51 Democrats, 49 Republicans. Democrats have increased their majority in the United States Senate, and they did it with this Georgia runoff, this last race of the cycle to be called. I want you to note here, right now in the vote count, you have Raphael Warnock, 82,801 votes ahead of Herschel Walker, 51.2% to 48.8%. This is 99% of the estimated vote is in. Obviously, we've projected Warnock the winner here, but we're going to see these votes change as more vote gets reported. I want to note, if you look back to November 8th and you take a look at the runoff at the general election there, you see that Raphael Warnock emerged ahead of Herschel Walker by 37,675 votes. That was just 4 weeks ago. Look at how his margin increased to now 82,801 votes. Well, how did he do this? Take a look. We can show you. This is the votes as they came in tonight. I'm going to show you where Warnock overperformed what he did 4 weeks ago on November 8th. Nearly everywhere. I mean, save about 14 counties. He overperformed everywhere, including critically up here in the Atlanta area and in the suburbs. And that was a critical component to him edging ahead of Walker 4 weeks ago. And it is what drove his big victory tonight that gives Democrats that 51-seat majority, Casey.
So, David, can I ask you, and I realize this is the final race of 2022, but it also kickstarts 2024. I mean, we already have at least one announced Republican presidential candidate for 2024. Obviously, Georgia was a critical state in the 2020 election. I mean, what does this tell you about where Georgia stands in future presidential races? And how much of this do you think is about Donald Trump, and how much of is it about, fundamental changes in the electorate in Georgia?
Well, I think it's all of the above, because I think you see, obviously, a changing electorate. I mean, you'll remember, Casey, of course, you go back to 2008 and 2012, the Obama campaign manager, David Plouffe, always had Georgia on a list of the sort of reach that he believed that Democrats would get to. We saw Joe Biden flip that state. No doubt that had something to do with Donald Trump as well. And yes, Donald Trump played a role here, but so too did the coalition that Warnock was able to put together here. And when you ask, where does Georgia sit in 2024 presidential politics? It sits right at the center of it. I mean, this is a purple state that has Republican roots of recent decades, and clearly is going to be a place that both parties heavily invest in to compete in 2024.
It's amazing to see how the map's changed over the last 20 years. David Chalian, thank you very much, my friend. We really appreciate you being up with us. And here to talk about the Georgia Senate runoff, we have an incredibly distinguished panel of guests that is joining us for these early morning hours here in the United States. Paul Begala, a Democratic strategist and CNN political commentator. Alice Stewart, a Republican strategist, also a CNN political commentator. Laura Barone-Lopez, a White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, also one of our CNN political analysts. And April Ryan, who is a White House correspondent for the Griot and also a CNN political analyst. Thank you guys so much for being here tonight as we break this down late into the, I guess, early morning hours. It's not necessarily late as we get started here. But Paul Begala, let me start with you, just because you've been around, you've seen a lot. Georgia is not a state that necessarily was on the map for Democrats when you first got into this business. What did you see tonight as things unfolded here?
Well, I want to talk about Georgia in a minute. I'm wearing my Georgia Bulldogs tie. I've lived there and worked there.
Thank you for that.
And love that state.
Bulldog. Thank you for the tie.
And it is changing, though. But first of all, I want to talk about Reverend Warnock.
Okay.
It's hard to say after the guy who's won 4 races in 2 years that a star is born. But I thought, not just winning the way he did, with the weight of the world on his shoulders, with the hottest spotlight you could have, never a false note. And tonight's victory speech, we're going to talk a lot about Herschel Walker conceding, which is the right thing to do, and I'm proud he did it. But, oh my goodness, Reverend Warnock, he didn't gloat, he didn't exude, he didn't overinterpret. He wore a purple tie, just like I'm wearing my Georgia Bulldog tie. He wore a purple tie. He talked about bipartisanship. You could tell that he's a preacher.
Oh, yes. He basically gave a sermon as a victory speech.
Oh, my God. And when he...
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so a star is born. I mean, people wonder, where do the Democrats go after the current generation of leaders? My party has a lot of talent. And when you have a man who can win in a state where just a few years ago they were hunting us down with dogs, that puts him right at the top of the Democratic Party.
You know, it's interesting, Paul, and April, I'm really interested in your take on this, too. I mean, there's obviously been a lot of focus on Herschel Walker and all of his flaws as a candidate. All true. But the reality was, he was a flawed candidate standing up against someone who is incredibly talented with a very bright future. I mean, this was not a generic Democratic candidate in Reverend Warnock.
Yeah, Reverend Warnock is someone, again, who has felt the state of Georgia. He understands the state of Georgia, being a person from Georgia. He's also been in Baltimore. He preached in Baltimore as well. He's not all his life lived in Georgia, but he's seen some of the hurt that he is talking about tonight. He's seen people say, look, I need to be seen. And he talked about that. And he also said the vote, the critical nature of the vote.
He called it a prayer.
Yes.
Yes.
He said because it moves people to think and call for the betterment of this nation. And call and response. And people really resonated with that. And then also, he said, I see you. Because part of the problem in Georgia, as Paul and I had this conversation before, Paul likes to say, you know, Georgia's changing. It's changing, but we still had Ahmaud Arbery. When you talk about gunning down with dogs, we still had that. We still remember Ahmaud Arbery, and we still remember Forsyth County in the 80s when Forsyth had not one black person in that county, and now it's 4.4% black. But at the end of the day, Raphael Warnock is a man who wants to connect with the people. He says, I'm with you as I will serve you. But you juxtapose to what they had, a Republican candidate who was put there because he was a friend of Donald Trump and was on The Apprentice at one time, and also an attempt to bring black men into the Republican Party. It failed tonight.
Yeah. When I was just in Georgia last week, and there were a number of black voters that I spoke to who actually said that very thing, April. They said that they felt insulted, that and they felt as though Republicans were just running a black candidate and trying to win them over with representation rather than substance. And a lot of them questioned Walker's experience and felt as though he wasn't experienced enough to be a senator. On Warnock, that prayer line, as well as a lot of what we heard as well tonight, him talking about voter suppression was a big part of his stump speech throughout the campaign trail. And the fact that he really focused on voting rights and voter suppression, I think, was interesting, especially since it was part of his final message heading into the runoff.
Yeah. Alistair, let me bring you in here because I do want to make sure that at the top of the hour here, we get to underscore one of the things that Herschel Walker said in his concession speech, which, first of all, I think we do need to note his team put out in advance that he was going to concede tonight. He was not going to question the results. This is, of course, a state where Donald Trump aggressively not only questioned the results, but tried to pressure elections officials into changing results. And then Herschel Walker stood up and said, believe in the Constitution. This at a time when former President Trump, now a contender for the presidency in 2024, is saying that he wants to throw it out because of the massive fraud that was committed. I think it's fascinating whether, Walker said that off the cuff or whether that was written into his speech. Probably more likely. We're trying to report that out right now. What was your take on how the Walker team handled the final weeks and days of this race and how Walker himself handled the hours in the wake of us calling this race for Reverend Warnock?
I will say his speech tonight, I think he was gracious in defeat. I was impressed with how he thanked his team, he thanked his supporters, he thanked his donors, and really, I think, handled it in a very professional way. And look, acknowledging the fact that, Raphael Warnock was a great candidate. He ran a very disciplined campaign, and so much has been put on Herschel Walker and him being a flawed candidate, which is absolutely true. But we can't do so without also acknowledging the fact that Raphael Warnock was a strong candidate.
Agreed.
Herschel Walker getting into this race as the appointed candidate of Donald Trump was a fatal flaw, not of his own doing. Donald Trump was nowhere to be seen on the campaign trail, but that was simply a geography issue. He was all over this race. His fingerprints were on Herschel Walker. His stain was on Herschel Walker throughout this entire race. Donald Trump's influence on races across the country, he's been a huge weight, but it has been an anchor down on all of these candidates. And this is a huge wake-up call to Republicans. I'm hearing from Republicans all night long, this is it. This is the final straw. It's time to move on. We need to turn the page. And these are people from Iowa to Georgia and right here in Washington, D.C., saying that we're tired of losing. And the fact that Donald Trump appoints his self-appointed candidates to win these primaries, that doesn't help us if we cannot win a general election. And this is the final straw for many Republicans.
Sure. I mean, I guess my question is it the final straw, though, for the base voters? Because the reality is Republicans, in many cases, were in this position because they knew that the base was going to go along with whatever Trump wanted. That's how you ended up with people like Blake Masters out in Arizona who lost. J.D. Vance won in Ohio, but man, that race was closer than it should have been. Now we've got Herschel Walker losing in Georgia, and now you're facing a Republican primary potentially crowded with, many people you've worked for in the past. That potentially clears the way for, these voters who seem to stick with Donald Trump regardless. I mean, do you see any signs that they are changing their mind after what we've seen?
I think we saw evidence of that in Georgia with the governor's race. Brian Kemp won by eight points over Stacey Abrams, and he did so by keeping Trump's base on board and broadening the electorate because he focused on the policies of the state of Georgia. He focused on the economy and crime and education and did so with a positive message moving forward. He was also able to capitalize on his success as a governor, helping the state through COVID, focusing on the economy. And when we see Republicans like Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger, Secretary of State, who stood up against Trump, took his wrath, and still were able to come out on top, that's a good playbook moving forward. We saw also Glenn Youngkin in Virginia also doing a similar strategy in terms of let's focus on the policies and a positive vision moving forward and not standing aligned with Trump, standing up to Trump. that's where that's the future of the Republican Party, keeping his base on board, but broadening the electorate.
All right, let's pause for a second. I think Paul and April both want to jump in here, but we're going to have everybody back after the break. Paul Begala, Alice Stewart, Laura Barone-Lopez, April Ryan. But we are going to take a quick break right now. When we come back, it is, of course, a big celebration for Democrats. Our panel will be back to discuss Senator Raphael Warnock's victory in Georgia. Welcome back. U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock celebrating a major win. He's going to keep that title, the final race of the 2022 midterm election. CNN projects that Warnock will defeat Republican challenger Herschel Walker in this very close runoff election. His victory gives Democrats a 51 to 49 seat majority in the Senate, a pickup of 1 seat for President Biden's party. It is a critical seat, though. Warnock thanked his supporters at his campaign headquarters in Atlanta just a few minutes after Walker conceded the race. We're going to bring back our panel. We've got CNN political commentators Paul Begala and Alice Stewart, along with CNN political analyst Laura Barone-Lopez and April Ryan. So let's pick up with where we left off, which was we're discussing the state of Alice's party, what happens next, and how. I mean, look, the reality is, I covered the Capitol Hill under Donald Trump for the entirety of his administration. The reality was, privately, so many Republicans wanted nothing to do with him. They kept insisting privately this was going to be it, this was going to be the end of it. And frankly, it never happened until, of course, the voters rejected him finally in 2020. Now he's refused to accept that. I mean, Paul Begala, what is if you're Democrats looking at the campaign landscape here, watching this Republican primary start to take early shape, yes, you're wondering about President Biden and kind of the future of the Democrats for sure. But if you're looking at running against that kind of a scenario, how does what's unfolded through the midterms, and particularly in Georgia tonight, affect your outlook?
I think it's solid evidence that Trump can't lose a primary, but he can't win a general election. That's the conundrum the Republicans have, because you talked about it. He has this fanatical base. But both parties need to learn this lesson from Georgia and from the whole cycle, which is persuasion still matters. It's not only the base stupid. We talk all the time about the Trump base, or we talk about the Democratic base. Reverend Warnock, you heard Chillian, he improved his vote in 145 counties.
It's really
about 100 of them are Republican counties.
Yeah.
He reached out and got Republicans to vote for him. 140,000 Georgians last month voted Kemp Warnock. 140,000. Now that's used to be, a year or two ago we would have said ticket splitters are extinct.
Gone. They're gone. Yes.
Extinct.
Right.
So they're like
there's no such thing as the median voter anymore.
Right.
In parlance of pollsters.
There is. Scientists, by the way, found a harlequin frog in Ecuador. They thought it was extinct. That's how I feel about these ticket splitters.
I don't know what a harlequin frog is, but thank you.
But Democrats need to learn this too. If the only thing that Democrats talk about is their base, they will not be following the Warnock strategy, which is to reach out to see everyone. He talked about farmers. When's the last time you saw a Democrat talk about farmers on a victory night speech?
But farmers is on the table right now, especially in Georgia. You've got a lot of farmers who are having problems financially, especially in the midst of COVID. And then we have the Inflation Act that the president is talking about for distressed farmers, not just for black farmers, for people to be seen, for them to feel like they are heard, their issues are on the table for a politician means a lot. And character means a lot. Another Georgia pastor, Jamal Bryant from New Birth Church, said, character is the currency for new democracy. He texted that to me as he was at the Raphael Warnock acceptance speech. But at the end of the day, people want to be seen. Politics is not about party. It's not about politics. It's about people. And that's one thing I think politicians in Washington have forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, call me old-fashioned, but I got to tell you, the fact that character, I have always been a big believer that character should matter. It should be one of the most important things, no matter what your policy beliefs. And I think it was Scott Jennings, we're going to talk to later on in the hour, who was saying that some of Republicans were saying to him, like, hey, that actually really came through this time. And Alice, go ahead.
Well, one of the things we heard tonight from Senator Warnock about I hear you and I see you. And Donald Trump was able to make that connection with the Republican base as well in 2016 and 2020, giving voice to people across America that felt like no one was speaking up for them, no one was fighting for them. And one thing, being from Georgia, former Senator Zell Miller Democrat, but he was also very moderate.
A character.
One of the things that he said that has always stood out to me, he said, you want to find middle America, you want to find the average American. They're not on the right, they're not on the left, they're at Kmart. And those are the people that any person running in a general election in the future needs to reach out to the Kmart voters, the Walmart voters, because this extremism on right and left is not the winning formula. It's right down the middle.
Two quick things about the way Warnock was able to really win over those split ticket voters, those Republicans who voted, or those moderate voters who voted for Kemp and maybe Raffensperger as well, the Secretary of State, and then Warnock. I talked to one when I was in Georgia, and it came down to the fact that Herschel Walker was an election denier in 2020. And they said that, I'm sorry, but I can't vote for someone who is not going to stand up for the Constitution. And I know that tonight Walker said you need to believe in the Constitution to his supporters. But in the aftermath of 2020, he was full on Trump's train about lying about the election, saying that there was countrywide fraud, and actually was attacking Brian Kemp, the Republican governor in Georgia, as well as the Secretary of State. So it was interesting to see that Kemp then decided to come out and support Walker after he had been attacked by him in 2020 to try to win over those some 200,000 voters that voted for him and not for Walker. And clearly Walker wasn't able to close that gap, because on the stump, when you watched his stump speech across the state, it was all red meat. It was all about culture wars. He was very focused on gender identity, very anti-transgender athletes. And by comparison, Warnock talked about voting rights. He talked about expanding Medicaid in Georgia, and he talked about abortion access.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think when you listen to the different ways in which they were campaigning, especially in the final stretch, it really underscores also your point about trying to figure out how to appeal to people who are willing to consider both parties. As few as there may be nowadays, they still do really matter in these very close elections. All right, Paul Begala, Alice Stewart, Laura Barone-Lopez, April Ryan, you guys are going to stick around with us. We're going to have much more from Georgia later on this hour. Also ahead, the January 6th committee investigating the attack on the U.S. Capitol plans to make criminal referrals to the Justice Department. What the chairman says about who is going to be referred. Plus, guilty on all counts, the Trump Organization found guilty of a 15-year tax fraud scheme. What it might mean for Donald Trump's family business when we return. CNN projects incumbent Senator Raphael Warnock will keep his seat in Georgia, his Senate seat, and Democrats will strengthen their grip on that chamber. Warnock was able to net more than half the vote in the runoff, crossing that critical 50% threshold that you might remember from the previous race. But, of course, it was a seesaw for much of the night. The lead flipped back and forth between Warnock and Republican challenger Herschel Walker. The final race of this midterm election cycle now over. Warnock will soon begin his first full 6-year term in the Senate. We're also tracking major developments in the investigation into the U.S. Capitol riot. The January 6th House Select Committee plans to make criminal referrals to the Justice Department. The committee's chairman says the panel's not yet narrowed down everyone who would be referred or what charges might be recommended, but the decisions are going to come soon. Remember, the committee is set to wrap up its probe and publish a final report by the end of the year. Time's running out because Republicans are set to take control of the House and are widely expected to disband the panel. They lack the power to prosecute themselves, but the Justice Department has launched a parallel probe into the attack. Last month, former President Donald Trump sued the January 6th panel, claiming that he should be immune from testimony about the time that he was president. A New York jury, meanwhile, has found 2 Trump Organization companies guilty of multiple counts of tax fraud. And while the former U.S. president and his family were not charged directly in the case, the verdict could have further impacts on their business. CNN's Kara Scannell has more from New York.
After 2 days of deliberations, a New York jury found 2 entities of the Trump Organization guilty of a 15-year tax fraud scheme. The verdict, handed up by a jury of 8 men and 4 women, deals a blow to former President Donald Trump. Trump was not charged in the illegal scheme, but prosecutors told the jury that he explicitly sanctioned some of the tax fraud. The guilty verdict tarnishes the real estate company he built from the ground up and comes as Trump is embarking on a second run for the Republican nomination for president in 2024. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg said the verdict proved that in Manhattan there is one standard of justice. Over the 7-week trial, the jury heard testimony from Trump's one-time right-hand man, the company's former chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg. Weisselberg, who was on paid leave, pleaded guilty to the tax fraud scheme, and in exchange for a lighter prison sentence, he agreed to testify at the trial. Weisselberg testified that he and others received off-the-books compensation in the form of perks, apartments, luxury car leases, and for him, private school tuition for his grandchildren. Prosecutors told the jury the scheme was a win-win for everyone, both the executives and the company, that all paid less in taxes. The Trump Organization could face a maximum of $1.6 million in fines when it's sentenced next month. Lawyers for the Trump company said that they will appeal. Kara Scannell, CNN, New York.
Our thanks to Kara for that report. Joining me to talk more about this from New York, CNN senior political commentator Scott Jennings. He once served as a special assistant to former President George W. Bush and is a close confidant of the Senate Minority Leader. And CNN political commentator Bakari Sellers is with us. He is an attorney and former South Carolina State House Democrat. Thank you both for being here tonight. Scott, let me start with you on this Trump case. I mean, what, if any, impact do you think this ruling has on what Donald Trump's potential future in Republican politics is?
Yeah, it's hard to assess what any one thing is going to do, and I just think it's a multitude of things that have happened over the last month that have really eroded or degraded his ability to wage this campaign. His announcement was flat. You've got a number of investigation issues. You've got a number of political issues. I mean, this Georgia situation tonight is a massive blow to him. Georgia may be remembered as the state, I tweeted this a little earlier tonight, that breaks Donald Trump. He lost it in 2020. His candidates that he preferred in the primary lost. People have stood up to him in Georgia, in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party and in the suburbs and everywhere else, and said no to Donald Trump. And he's got this investigation going on over his actions after the 2020 election. This may be the state that does it. So I think it's hard to assess any one thing, Casey, but if you're looking at what's happened to him since he launched his campaign, it ain't good. That's a political science term, but it ain't good.
Very technical, Scott. Bakari,
Yeah.
I mean, your home state of South Carolina is setting up to take on a new role in the Democratic primary process, but of course the Republican situation is likely to be a messy and long one, and it's going to be impacted by these things that we've just run through. I mean, let's take these issues one at a time. I mean, between the Trump Organization news we saw today, I mean, what is your take there? I mean, do you agree with Scott? You know, none of this necessarily matters one thing at a time, or the criminal referral from January 6th to the Department of Justice. We're still waiting on what they're going to do.
Well, I do agree with Scott somewhat. I think it all matters, and I think that drip by drip it matters more and more. And follow me on this, guys, because I actually think it benefits and helps Donald Trump. And why do I say that? I say that because it's going to embolden so many other people to run for president of the United States and challenge him. Of course, he just wants to have a coronation in his nomination process, but that doesn't look like it's going to be the case. And what I believe Scott will tell you that if there's 15, 20 people on stage, Donald Trump is more likely, because he still controls anywhere from a quarter to a third of the Republican base, he's more likely to come out of that victorious. Because what the Republican Party hasn't done, and nobody's talked about this or mentioned this, is they haven't structurally changed their Republican nominating process. As long as states are winner-take-all states and someone can only get a quarter of the vote, all of these little things, the January 6 indictments that may or may not come, the prosecution of the Trump businesses, his losses in Georgia, all that means is that you're going to have all these one percenters. And one percenters, I mean Mike Rogers, I mean Mike Pence, I mean Mike Pompeo. I mean all of these individuals who can't get more than 1% of the electorate because they don't have a base are going to all run, but they can't beat Donald Trump because they refuse to take him on. So I actually think drip by drip, each thing that we've seen happen in this puzzle over the past month has done nothing but help Donald Trump.
All right, Scott, your name was invoked. Your response?
Yeah, look, I think Bakari's right about the rules. A massive fragmented field does benefit a candidate like Trump. I think the question is, how long will all these people stay in? I think Bakari's right. Some of these folks don't really have much of a chance. But the question will be, do they stay in the race long enough to fragment the field? Last time around in 2016, you had people staying in way too long, and so it would benefit this thing to winnow down sooner so that you had sort of one strong alternative. I think if you got it down to that today, look at some of the national polling that's come out Casey. I mean, it's obvious that Republicans are looking to move on here.
I don't disagree with you at all on that, and I think we've seen some evidence in the midterm elections that would show that if they were able to pick someone other than Donald Trump, it's entirely possible they could win a national election. Look at Brian Kemp and other Republicans. But look, Scott Walker, back in 2016, he tried to warn everyone in September, actually, of 2015, that they all needed to clear out, and nobody's ego would allow it. And I'm not going to lie, I've covered politics long enough to know that, like, the ego that it takes to think you should be president of the United States means, like, these people don't drop out.
Yeah, it could be. I hope not. I do think that DeSantis
Are you going to convince him yourself? Is Mitch McConnell going to convince him?
Well, I will say that today DeSantis, it strikes me, is a little bit different kind of a candidate than existed in 2016. I don't think Trump's ever actually faced another Republican who has the reservoir of support, the deep affection of support that DeSantis does, not just because of what he did as governor, but this crushing victory he scored in Florida, juxtaposed against what looks like a lot of defeats against Trump. So I do think he's a bit of a stronger player. That's not going to stop others, but it looks to me like he's on a rocket ship right now, and he's still got room to grow. So, you know, we'll see how it develops. That's what primaries are for. We'll see if people learn the lessons of the past. But Trump's there to be beaten, and that's the only way he's going to go away is for Republicans to beat him in a primary. He ain't going to be hauled off to jail in time. You know, whatever. He's not going to go. He has to be beaten. He has to be beaten. And a Republican has to do it. That's my view.
Bakari, you get last word here. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I love when Republicans talk about Ron DeSantis because Republicans fail to remember history. Ron DeSantis is none other than Scott Walker. It's funny you invoked this name. He's somebody who came off of a resounding election. At that time, Scott Walker came off of beating back a recall. But it's like Icarus, he got too close to the sun, and we know how that ended up. Ron DeSantis and no one else. I mean, we talk about all these things, the Constitution, et cetera. What no one else has done is actually throw a first punch at Donald Trump or shown they've been able to take one. And so I don't have faith that Ron DeSantis can do that. Today was a horrible day for Donald Trump on all fronts. He hasn't had a very good day in a very long period of time. In fact, until Scott said it, I forgot he actually announced for president of the United States. Today was a good day. And if we saw anybody, if Joe Biden does not win, or does not run for president of the United States, I think you saw somebody today who could be one of the many people who run in 2024.
All right, Bakari Sellers, Scott Jennings, we could keep talking about this, but I'm going to let you guys both go to bed. Thank you so much for staying up late with us tonight. We really appreciate it.
We'll be back in the morning. No worries.
We will see you then. All right, sounds great. This runoff, of course, has highlighted how Georgia has really become the epicenter of American politics. Once a reliably red state, it now seems to be a true swing state. We're going to talk to about Georgia's political DNA coming up next. Welcome back. Democratic U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock has beaten the Trump-backed Republican Herschel Walker in the Georgia Senate runoff. And during his victory speech, Warnock said, quote, "After a hard-fought campaign, you've got me for 6 more years." Walker conceded almost immediately, remarkably, telling his supporters to never stop dreaming or believing in America and its elected officials. Let's get analysis from someone who is on the ground in Georgia. I'm joined by Tia Mitchell. She is the Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. An excellent paper. She joins me from Atlanta. Tia, you have covered the ins and outs of this race for a very, very long time now. We knew this was going to be really at the center of the battle for the Senate. Honestly, the fact that it was for the 51st seat and not the 50th was in some ways pretty remarkable here. But I will say, because all of the sources that I talked to, none of them were surprised by the fact that Warnock was able to pull this out. I'm interested to know what you were hearing from your sources and what they're telling you tonight about what this all means.
Yeah, we knew that Warnock's team came into Election Day very confident. They felt they built up a big lead during early voting. And then once the polls closed and results started trickling in, it became clear pretty quickly that there just weren't enough votes out there for Herschel Walker to win this race. The bigger counties, DeKalb, Fulton, Cobb, and Gwinnett, as, because for a while it was kind of 50-50 and Herschel Walker at times would be slightly ahead. But when we looked at the counties that still had the most counting to do, these were counties that were going for Warnock 80%, 75%. And so it just became clear that the math was not in Herschel Walker's favor. I think that the people who support Raphael Warnock, that's what they thought was going to happen. But at the same time, they were cautiously optimistic. They said they didn't want to count their chickens before all the eggs had hatched because anything could happen if Election Day had been strong for Herschel Walker.
Sure. So Tia, let me ask you, you mentioned voting, and that, of course, in so many ways has become a central theme in our politics generally, whether it's the questioning of elections, election fraud, to questions about voter suppression, to in Georgia in particular, that early voting was so important here. And one of the things that I've heard from Republicans is that they're very frustrated with the fact that their voters don't seem to trust early voting as part of the process, and that it really, really hurt them. What does your reporting tell you about the impact on the results here from the willingness or lack thereof of Republicans to vote early?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's truly something that the Republican Party is grappling with, but that's a problem that Republicans brought onto themselves. And, not all Republicans, but we know that particularly in 2020, there became this shift towards prioritizing election day voting. There was all this criticism from Republicans, particularly allies of President Donald Trump, that began to criticize voting by mail, criticizing the use of drop boxes, criticizing different ways during the pandemic that a lot of municipalities made voting easier for everyone. And so Republicans, in criticizing that, kind of turned off a lot of their voters to make it seem like some of those methods weren't solid or weren't reliable. But what we're seeing now is that Republicans now aren't reaping the benefits the way Democrats are, again, about ways to vote that are very popular for people. I think also in Georgia, when Republicans said that Saturday after Thanksgiving would not be available for early voting, and we know Warnock's campaign and the Democratic Party sued and they won. Not only did that provide another day of early voting in counties that decided to opt in, but it became another rallying cry for Democrats. Democrats were able to say, this is an example of Republicans making it harder to vote, suppressing the vote. This became something that we heard from Warnock on the campaign stage in the closing weeks of the runoff, and it was a powerful message. I think it paid off. In a lot of counties, Warnock performed better than he did in November.
Yeah, pretty remarkable. All right, Tia Mitchell, thank you very much for staying up late with us. Your reporting on this race has been stellar throughout, so thank you very much for being with us. And I will be back with much more on the Georgia Senate runoff at the top of the hour with our All-Star panel. But first, John Vous picks up our top international headlines after the break.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm John Vous. Our coverage of the Georgia Senate runoff election continues in a moment. But first, the latest on the war in Ukraine. And just as Ukraine appears to develop a long-range attack drone, it seems Russia has exhausted its supply of Iranian-made combat drones. In the early morning hours Tuesday, thick black smoke could be seen above a Russian airfield about 60 miles from the Ukrainian border. Russian officials say a drone strike set fuel storage tanks on fire. Officially, there was no comment from Ukraine, but this would appear to be the third attack in 2 days on military bases inside Russia. These drone strikes on Russian soil come amid a months-long Russian air offensive on Ukraine's power grid, which has caused widespread blackouts. During a press briefing Tuesday, the US Secretary of State was asked if the Ukrainian strikes were morally justified.
We have neither encouraged nor enabled the Ukrainians to strike inside of Russia, but the important thing is to understand what Ukrainians are living through every day with the ongoing Russian aggression against their country, and our determination to make sure that they have in their hands, along with many other partners around the world, the equipment that they need to defend themselves, to defend their territory, to defend their freedom.
And what appears to be yet another setback for Moscow, as Western officials say Russia has exhausted its supply of Iranian-made attack drones. Officials in Washington and Kyiv have noted the Shahed 136 in particular has not been used by the Russians for the past 2 weeks. A lawsuit against the Saudi Crown Prince for his role in the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi has been thrown out of court by a US federal judge. Well, the ruling noted credible allegations of Mohammed bin Salman's involvement in the killing of Khashoggi. The decision to dismiss was based on the Biden administration's earlier recommendation of immunity as head of state. Bin Salman was appointed prime minister by his father in September. The judge expressed his uneasiness, noting the suspicious timing of the prince's appointment. The lawsuit was brought by Khashoggi's fiancée and a human rights organisation Khashoggi founded before his death in 2018. I'm John Force, live at the CNN Centre, KC in DC. We'll be back with more of our special election coverage right after this.
Hello and welcome to our viewers in the United States and around the world. I'm Casey Hunt, live in Washington. U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock says the people have spoken. After his second hard-fought runoff in 2 years, CNN projects he will win re-election and serve a full term as senator. The Georgia Democrat defeats Republican challenger Herschel Walker. It's a fitting end to a very disappointing midterm election cycle for the GOP, at least if you're a Democrat. The GOP only had modest gains in the House. Democrats are actually in better shape than they were before in the Senate. They now hold the chamber 51-49. It was previously 50-50. That will give them majorities in every committee. Why is that important? It lets them process legislation and especially nominations much more quickly. Senator Warnock thanked supporters at his campaign headquarters in Atlanta nearly 2 hours ago. The incumbent Democrat pledged to walk with the people of his state and represent all Georgians.
After a hard-fought campaign, or should I say campaigns, it is my honor to utter the four most powerful words ever spoken in a democracy. The people have spoken. Georgia, I don't want you to miss what you've done. In a moment in which there were folk trying to divide our country, and those forces are very much at work right now, Georgia did an amazing thing. In 2021, it sent its first African-American senator and its first Jewish senator to the United States Senate in one fell swoop. You have done it again. Thank you, Georgia. Now there are those who will look at the outcome of this race and say that, yes, you're right, we won. But there are those who would look at the outcome of this race and say that there's no voter suppression in Georgia. Let me be clear. Just because people endured long lines that wrapped around buildings, some blocks long, just because they endured the rain and the cold and all kinds of tricks in order to vote, doesn't mean that voter suppression does not exist. It simply means that you, the people, have decided that your voices will not be silenced.
And former President Barack Obama tweeted just a little while ago. He wrote, "Once again, Georgians have proven that when it comes time to vote, they'll show up and vote for a leader who will fight for them. Congratulations, Reverend Warnock." Let's turn to the magic wall and our CNN political director, David Chalian, who is back with us tonight. David, Barack Obama obviously was involved in this race. We saw him go down there for Herschel Walker, campaign for him pretty hard. Even Michelle Obama actually cut a robocall for Raphael Warnock. They obviously were trying to get Democratic voters excited. What role do you think that played, and what else would you underscore tonight in terms of why Warnock was able to bring this home?
Yeah, Obama was down there before the general 4 weeks ago, and he went back in for the runoff. That's something that Joe Biden was not invited to do in those closing days of the campaign there. So clearly the Warnock team thought that Obama could be helpful in getting some of that Democratic base vote out. Take a look at where we are, Casey, here. We've got 99% of the vote in. Votes are still going to be trickling in until we get a full count, but Warnock is 89,712 votes ahead of Herschel Walker, 51.3% to 48.7%. How did he do it? I want you to take a look at the 4 largest counties in Georgia, up here in the Atlanta area. Let's start with Fulton County, home to Atlanta. Look at Raphael Warnock's number. I just want you to look. That's today in the runoff, 76.5% of the vote. Look what it was on November 8th. He was at 73.5%. He overperformed here, okay? Take a look next door. In Cobb County, back in November in the general, he had 56.8% of the vote there. Today in Cobb County, he overperformed his general election performance, 59.3%. We can go over to Gwinnett County. Today, he had 62.1%. Back in November 8th, Warnock was at 58.9%. So you see, he overperformed where the voters are. And in 3 of those 4 largest counties, Herschel Walker underperformed what he did just 4 weeks ago. This was a battle for suburban independent voters in this critical area in Georgia, in the Atlanta area, this critical suburban population here. And Warnock showed that he had the ability to actually increase his performance precisely where Walker needed to do it. Remember, Brian Kemp got some 200,000 more votes just 4 weeks ago than Walker. His critical mission was to find some of those votes in this area and bring them on board. He failed to do so, Casey.
I mean, when you look at this, and I mean, you've been thinking about and studying these questions for a really long time. I mean, why is it, do you think, voters were willing to say, I'll vote for Brian Kemp and I will also vote for Raphael Warnock, especially in a world where we thought, Paul Begala was talking about this earlier, we thought basically ticket splitters were dead?
Yeah, I mean, we do live in an era of very polarized politics. There's no doubt about that, and we have seen a decrease in ticket splitting. But the reality is, Brian Kemp was presenting to voters a different kind of Republican than Herschel Walker was. Herschel Walker was tied to Donald Trump. Georgia rejected Donald Trump just 2 years ago in the presidential race and those 2 Senate races. And Herschel Walker was going down that path, where Brian Kemp, I mean, Donald Trump, perhaps his battle with him helped him become an appeal to maybe some independent voters, that he was the antithesis of Trump inside the Republican Party context, a Republican that wasn't beholden to Trump. No doubt that had a lot to do with that 200,000 vote differential.
Yeah, no, of course. All right, David Chalian, thank you very much, my friend. Great to have you here. And here to discuss the Senate runoff is our panel of esteemed guests: Paul Begala, Democratic strategist, CNN political commentator; Alice Stewart, Republican strategist and CNN political commentator; Laura Barone-Lopez is a White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, as well as a CNN political analyst; and April Ryan, who's a White House correspondent for The Griot, also a CNN political analyst. Great to have you all back at the table tonight. And This morning. Is it this morning? I've lost track of time. We'll see how we're doing it. Right now it's 1 in the morning Eastern time here in the United States. We've got a lot of viewers joining us from overseas tonight as well. But Alice, I mean, we've been talking about, and I kind of want to focus in on the state of Georgia and the landscape and how it's changing or not, because it's shaping up to be a critical state in the 2024 presidential race. And if you pick up on what David Chalian was pointing out, I mean, this is still a state that will vote for a Republican pretty much for any office if, in fact, they present in a certain way. I mean, what does that mean as Republicans look ahead?
One thing to follow up on David's numbers, I think what was fascinating what we saw in where Herschel Walker underperformed in many areas in the state, I attribute that to one thing, and one thing solely, is the fact that the control of the Senate was not at stake. I've spoken with Republicans ever since the midterm elections. They were ready to go all in on a runoff in Georgia if control of the Senate was at stake. Big fundraisers, people doing bus tours across the state that were ready to get out the vote for whoever this might be, the Republican candidate. But when that wasn't an option, enthusiasm just went through the floor, and it was just not there. But if you step back and look at the landscape and the color of Georgia, it is still a conservative state. It's in the Bible Belt. It's a very conservative state. We have constitutional offices from Georgia to the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, all Republican. The state legislature, the House and Senate, Republican. The only time it is leaning to the blue and a Democrat is when Donald Trump's involved. And he lost the state when we had the runoff with Perdue and Loeffler. We lost those races. We lost this one because Donald Trump does not work in Georgia. Trumpism is dead in Georgia. Conservative Republicanism is still alive and well.
It depends on what part of Georgia Trumpism is dead. That's a whole different thing. Look at Dalton, Georgia. Straight up.
I think we can say the suburbs of the Atlanta metro area where many Republican voters live, they're not down with Donald Trump. Rural Georgia may be a different story. But April, what do you think about the state in general? I mean, is this a place where Democrats could have been performing more strongly earlier than they have? I mean, what do you attribute this to?
So, a lot of what Alice said is correct, but Georgia is purple. Let's just say it. I believe, looking back at these last presidential elections, especially when Hillary Clinton ran for president against Donald Trump, if she kept going into Georgia like she did, she could have possibly won Georgia. She had stopped talking about guns so she could get more of the Southern vote. But I believe that Hillary Clinton's run set up the situation for Stacey Abrams and Raphael Warnock to knock a lot of those barriers down to change that red state blue. Okay, and now we're in a purple moment, and I think it's kind of synonymous with what's going on in the Republican Party. Georgia's trying to find itself, just like the Republican Party is trying to sift out and figure out who it is in this moment.
Laura, April mentions Hillary Clinton, but I also want to ask about Stacey Abrams, because I have had Democratic sources who, while they may have questions about her own personal political campaigns, they're very impressed with the organization she has built there, and they give her a lot of credit for how Democrats have done. I mean, what's your reporting telling you?
Yeah, that was something that I was actually going to bring up, which was the entire ground game that has changed for Democrats in the state of Georgia, really starting, a lot of people say, from 2016 on. So many of the groups that are based there formed after 2016 in response to Donald Trump, but they're black-led groups, they're groups that are led by young voters and young people, and I think that they're really trying to mobilize this changing Georgia, these changing demographics in Georgia, whether it's mobilizing the young vote, which went, I think, about 60% or so or more for Warnock in the general, and then also black voters and Asian American voters. We've seen them grow as a bigger bloc that have appeared to go more Democratic than Republican so far in the past few election cycles. And so that's what these groups have really harnessed. They knocked on someone, I was there, they said that they were nearing, potentially more than 3 million doors that they had knocked on across the state, and repeatedly engaging voters in any way they could possibly find in order to try to tell them that they needed to go out and vote in the runoff election. The other thing is that, again, in the early vote, Democrats have focused heavily on that early vote, focused heavily on mail voting in a way that Republicans have not, partially because former President Donald Trump has attacked mail voting, has said that he thinks Republicans should vote on Election Day.
When he has voted by mail.
And I want to let Paul get in here, too.
Georgia is changing. Yeah. Okay, I worked for Zell Miller back in the day. He was one of my mentors.
Of course you did.
Right. Oh, he was one of my mentors. In fact, he's the guy who introduced me to Bill Clinton, which kind of created my whole career. I loved Zell. But go into more recent history. A decade ago, I'm working for Barack Obama's super PAC. He lost Gwinnett County, one of those counties, those giant suburban counties that Shelley just showed us. He lost Gwinnett by 10. Barack Obama, talented politician. Reverend Warnock won by 24.
Wow.
We were talking earlier, April, about Forsyth County, which is all white. Now it's about 4% black, but it was 0% black when President Obama was running in 2012. He got 17%. That's it, 17%. Reverend Warnock today got 34.
Even though it's only a change in the black population.
It's 4% black.
4%.
So the state is changing, and the candidates are changing, right? I mean, I thought Of course, I loved Obama. I thought Reverend Warnock did a terrific job of reaching out suburbanites and exurbanites and adding to that, or beginning with that base of young people, African Americans. It's a very hard thing to do.
And that
because
goes,
it's a large, diverse party, but the state is
briefly,
changing.
we're about to wrap.
Okay.
Yeah. No, let's put a pin in this for right now. We've got, because we're gonna come back from the break and we're gonna keep talking about all this. It's obviously we have a ton to say about this critical race. So our panel is going to stand by, and we will be right back. U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock is celebrating tonight a major win in the final race of the 2022 midterm elections. CNN projects he will defeat Republican challenger Herschel Walker in a very close runoff election, although not necessarily that close by modern American political standards. His victory gives Democrats a 51-49 seat majority in the Senate. That is a pickup of 1 seat for President Biden's Democratic Party. President Biden did tweet a short time ago. He says, just called Senator Warnock to congratulate him on his win. Tonight, Georgia voters stood up for our democracy, rejected ultra-MAGA-ism, and most importantly, sent a good man back to the Senate. Here's to 6 more years. We are back now with our panel, who was all scrambling to get in there as we went to break. So let's try to pick up where we left off. April, Paul was talking a little bit about Forsyth County. You guys had been talking about how that had changed, and whether or not the state, how deeply it may or may not be changing in Democrats' favor.
So one thing we have to remember, and you guys brought it up on the other side of the table earlier, people need to feel seen and heard. And one part of the problem is, and you brought this up, Alice, a minute ago, you said being in the center. Sometimes that center leaves all the other sides out. And people, that's some of the reason why we are finding such extreme behavior in politics now, because people are feeling like, I'm not seen, I'm not heard, you're not talking to me. Now, what Raphael Warnock did, one of the things that he did to his credit for his win, is he not only focused in on his home base of Atlanta, where the church where he pastors is centered. He went into rural Georgia. He talked to white rural Georgians who may have had some neighbors who might not have wanted to talk to him, you know, because of his race. Right. But he went into territories in Georgia that Herschel Walker was walking. And let's talk about this too, character, the character issue. We didn't even bring that up. I was in Atlanta twice over the last month and a half with my book tour. And I couldn't even leave the room for watching those nasty attack ads. And those Georgians who voted were very repulsed by the ads that they were seeing. So it's several issues, I think, that are colliding. Character, I feel seen, and character, again.
You know, one of the things that's so interesting, April, and, you know, Alice, I'd be interested in your take on this, too, since your name was invoked, but Warnock is not the only candidate, the only Democratic candidate this cycle to do this. I mean, he was, much more than Herschel Walker, the way that he framed his arguments was more inclusive, was more focused in, I don't even want to say a bipartisan way. He spent more time talking to and framing it as, I am talking to all people. The other candidate that comes to mind for me, I'm from Pennsylvania, is John Fetterman, who spent a lot of time in places where Donald Trump won over white, and up there it's a lot of union voters. And he talked about the fact that just because we don't think that these people are going to vote for us, that doesn't mean that we can't go talk to them and make them feel included in the process. And I don't see Republicans doing that the way that some of these Democrats who were successful were able to this year.
Raphael Warnock is a tremendous candidate, and he also benefited from the power of incumbency. Being a sitting senator, he had more of a pulpit than, so to speak, than Herschel Walker.
He also had some authority from his actual pulpit, quite honestly.
Exactly. And he was able to convey and demonstrate a message of working across the aisle, building a bridge, as he talked about this evening. And let me just say this, that I wanted to point out while I had the opportunity. Hats off to my dear friend LaTosha Brown and Black Voters Matter for working so hard and tirelessly to get out the vote for him. And as long as she's on board in Georgia, the Democratic Party is in good shape.
She was singing while she was getting people to the polls.
Yeah, she was, and it's hats off to her. I'm really excited for her. But here's the thing: while Raphael Warnock was out there talking about building bridges. You also had Governor Kemp out there reminding voters across Georgia that Raphael Warnock is a rubber stamp for Biden's policies. And that didn't work for many people in Georgia when we have the economy the way it is, crime on the rise, parents concerned about their children's education. Those were policies that did not work for a lot of people in Georgia. So
sure, and he won.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the point being, while he's talking about building bridges, we had Republicans on the other side trying to remind voters that his policies are not working. Clearly, his message of unity and working across the aisle resonated with more Georgians.
I think it didn't. Yeah. I think it didn't work simply because even though Kemp, he was only out there during the runoff for Walker. He was not out there or really tying himself to Walker during the general election.
I mean, he didn't want to be tied to Walker.
Right.
He actively wanted to avoid it.
Right.
And there's reasons why.
Right. And Kemp may have run on the economy and all those policy issues that you just talked about, Alice, but Walker, watching his stump speech multiple times, he did not talk about the economy in any real consistent way. He talked about making America energy independent a few times, but he really focused on transgender athletes. He really talked a lot about, like, I don't know what a pronoun is, and he repeated over and over again.
I mean,
do you
it was
want
pretty
some
Trumpian, right?
Yeah, it was very Trumpian.
Very
He said, do you want someone like me who's going to play sports against your daughter? I would be able to play sports against your daughter. He also talked about heaven and hell a lot, and basically equating voting for Democrats going to hell. So I think that all of that, he did not talk about any type of policies that he would vote for or the economy at all.
Right. So to that point, so Walker loses, saying all those things. Kemp wins. And Paul Begala, I got to ask you, because you're the Democrat sitting at the table. I mean, how do you think President Biden played into this or not? I mean, he was not, they didn't really want to have him down there. There wasn't a lot of animosity, but they were kind of like, keep your distance, and he did. He potentially is the one on the ticket, most likely on the ticket for Democrats in 2024.
And he won Georgia in 2020, and I think he's well positioned to win it in 2024. It's wise not to go in there. He's not popular right now. So, I mean, it's pretty simple. And Barack Obama is. The Democrats have a large arsenal. We don't just have Mr. Trump, right? Like the Republicans.
But so how do you fix that between now and 24?
Well, you do a good job, but just as importantly, you push off against their extremism. Voters don't want extremism. Did you know, this is my favorite piece of political trivia. This is the first time since citizens began electing senators in 1914, 108 years, that every single incumbent senator of each party who sought re-election won. It's never, ever happened in America. Why, in such a volatile time, you'd think they'd throw all the bums out? It's because Ron Johnson won, I think unfairly, I'm a Democrat, by characterizing the Democrat as too extreme. He won in Wisconsin.
That is
he
true.
said Mandela Barnes was too extreme. Fetterman, Oz, now tonight, Reverend Warnock, they characterized the Republicans as too extreme. This is what Mark Kelly did in Arizona. This is what Catherine Cortez Masto did in Nevada. Voters don't want extremism. Now, by the way, the Democrats need to learn that too. My party needs to understand they didn't marry the Democrats, they just dumped the Republicans. So you guys...
But you're absolutely right. But I think...
Final word. Final word.
Oh, yeah. There's so many layers in this moment. It's not just about what you just said, but let's talk about the issue. Voters don't want people telling them what they cannot do. Let's talk about how you go to the polls or when you can go to the polls. I can't stand in line and have someone give me food or I'll go to jail. People don't want that. And also right now, the stakes are so high. I had a bunch of people send me pictures of the long lines that they had stood in for hours in early voting because they were rebelling against what was told that they could not do.
Yeah.
So it's the spirit of the human spirit came out, I believe, in this moment in Georgia as well.
All right, Paul Begala, Alice Stewart, Laura Barone-Lopez, April Ryan, everyone is going to stick around into the early morning hours here on the East Coast of the United States. And still to come, the House committee investigating the Capitol riot plans to make criminal referrals to the Justice Department. What the chairman of that committee says about who could be on the list. Plus, a jury finds the Trump Organization guilty of tax fraud. Could the ruling hurt Donald Trump's chances at getting back to the White House? It's the eternal question, and we will discuss it up next. The final race of the midterm election finally over, and against the odds, it seems, Democrats have boosted their hold on the U.S. Senate. That's after incumbent Raphael Warnock hung on to win re-election in the Georgia Senate runoff. He defeated former President Donald Trump's hand-picked candidate Herschel Walker, who conceded with grace. A New York jury, meanwhile, has found 2 Trump Organization companies guilty of multiple counts of tax fraud. The case was over a 15-year scheme carried out by top executives who kept lavish perks and bonuses off the books. A high-ranking executive pleaded guilty to 15 different felony charges, admitting he failed to pay taxes on nearly $2 million worth of income. It comes as Donald Trump is pursuing the Republican nomination for president yet again. And while he and his family were not charged in the case, the verdict could, of course, have further impacts on their businesses. Attorneys for the Trump Organization say that they will appeal. And we're tracking major developments in the investigation into the U.S. Capitol riot. The January 6th House Select Committee plans to make criminal referrals to the Justice Department. CNN's Sarah Murray has more from Washington.
The House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol will move forward with criminal referrals to the Justice Department. That's what Chairman Benny Thompson had to say about where the committee's work stands. Now, they wouldn't say who they are planning to refer to the Department of Justice, but sources are telling CNN that the committee is weighing criminal referrals for President Donald Trump as well as for a number of his allies. They are focused, we are told, on the main organizers and the leaders of the attack. Now, the criminal referral is not binding when it goes to the Justice Department. It is up to DOJ, up to Merrick Garland to decide how they want to proceed, and they have already been proceeding with their own criminal investigation. But it is a significant culmination of the committee's work. It's an indication that they believe they have gathered enough evidence to conclude that crimes have been committed. Of course, we are waiting to hear more details from the committee, a full list of folks they may refer for criminal prosecution to the Justice Department, as well as what these predicate acts are that they are referring for potential prosecution. Sarah Murray, CNN on Capitol Hill.
And our thanks to Sarah Murray for that report. Joining us now from Allentown, Pennsylvania is CNN political commentator and former U.S. House Republican Charlie Dent, and Democratic strategist Caroline Heldman joins us from Los Angeles. Thank you both for being here. And Charlie, let me start with you, since this is your political party, I'm not sure necessarily if I want to call him the leading figure again. He is, I guess, the only declared Republican presidential candidate in 2024. So we will go with that. What is your take on how this pair of developments will or will not impact the president's political plans and aspirations?
Well, clearly, Casey, there is no good news for President Trump out of tonight. The 2 Trump organizations, were found guilty of criminal tax fraud, while the former president himself, doesn't seem to be in immediate legal jeopardy over this matter. This is a really bad political headline. Your company's been convicted of criminal tax fraud. I mean, and he's going to say, what, he didn't know about it? Okay, well, good luck with that one. That's so at least from a political standpoint, this is extremely unhelpful. And of course, the January 6th committee is issuing a report. They're making this criminal referral, which, of course, DOJ is doing their own investigation, as was stated by Sarah Murray. But bottom line is, this is just a big red bow that the January 6th committee is wrapping around their report. Here, read page 10, line 6, and telling them, that certain people they believe through their investigation have committed criminal acts. So again, DOJ, may not need this referral. But again, if you're Donald Trump, this is not helpful. And as we've learned, that Donald Trump and many of his candidates cannot defy political gravity. Look at what just happened tonight in Georgia, a very winnable race thrown away because of candidate issues. He's got all kinds of problems here. His announcement was anemic at best. So I think Donald Trump has got some real issues. He actually has many Republicans now speaking up more forcefully against him. Chris Christie and others are speaking out forcefully against him. So he's not going to get, I don't think he's going to get such an easy pass this time around from his challengers.
So, Caroline, let me get you to weigh in on this, because you're a Democratic strategist. You also study these things. The reality was that Donald Trump, for a long, long time, defied everything we thought we knew about the laws of political gravity and the way voters were going to react to certain things. But it does seem perhaps that's all catching up with him. How do you see these developments in the context of what's set to happen in the 2024 race?
That's a great question. And I think for a while, he's actually been pretty toxic for the Republican Party electorally. You know, if you look at 2018, he lost 40 seats. 2020, he loses the election and harms candidates down ballot. 2022, he handpicks a number of candidates. Mitch McConnell, the Senate minority leader, gets really mad at him, as he knows these are weak candidates, and this is the last of the weak candidates. And once again, Trump-backed, handpicked, and he lost. And so I imagine that heading into 2024, that with Warnock there, something really interesting is going to happen on the Democratic side that I haven't seen a lot of folks talking about. And this is the fact that it relieves pressure off of Joe Manchin to take more Democratic or liberal positions. He can take more conservative positions now. He can take the hit, if you will, in order to get reelected the next time around. So it actually, this election happening right now with Warnock going into the Senate helps the Democrats in a couple of years hold on to seats. It also, of course, gives them control over the committees instead of sharing it with Republicans. So Donald Trump, I mean, the Republican Party is certainly starting to recognize that he is not helping the party electorally.
Yeah, no, it's I'm glad you actually mentioned that about Joe Manchin, because I do think it is important. He can literally vote no on everything Joe Biden ever wanted, and Democrats can still pass things and nominate people if that's what they want to do. Charlie Dent, let me also ask you about Georgia specifically tonight, because Herschel Walker made some pretty noteworthy comments in what my colleague Jeff Zeleny says seemed to be an ad-libbed concession speech. He said there was no visible teleprompter being used or anything like that, but the reality was he still said what he said. Let me show you the piece of the Herschel Walker speech that stood out to me, and then we'll talk about it. Watch.
One of the things I want to tell all of you is you never stop dreaming. I don't want any of you to stop dreaming. I don't want any of you to stop believing in America. I want you to believe in America and continue to believe in the Constitution and believe in our elected officials most of all. Continue to pray for them, because all the prayers you've given me, I felt those prayers.
Believe in the Constitution. This is something that Donald Trump, of course, said that none of us should do. He said we should terminate the Constitution more recently. What do you make of Walker's remarks and the bigger picture that he graciously conceded this race on election night, which is not something that, you know, was a guarantee from a lot of Republican candidates going into this midterm?
Well, I do believe that, you know, Herschel Walker's concession speech was about the best thing he did during this campaign. He was gracious and he was articulate and coherent, which he wasn't during the campaign. He was, let's be honest, he was a terrible candidate. I mean, he had issues of domestic abuse, allegations against him, abortion,
serious
hypocrisy,
ones.
Not taking care of his children, per his son, who went very public about that, you know, ignoring his children, residency issues, general incoherence on a number of policy issues. And of course, then there was the werewolf vampire debate. I mean, there were just so many things. And you know, I'm glad he gave the speech he gave tonight. I think that's helpful. But, you know, we just can't get back to this issue, how Republicans are losing winnable seats, not just here, but in Pennsylvania, in Arizona, even New Hampshire. I mean, it's not just the bad candidates Donald Trump selected, or the weak or weaker candidates, this being the worst case. It's the candidates who chose not to run in Arizona, like Governor Ducey, who was very popular, or maybe Governor Sununu in New Hampshire. This is what Donald Trump has done to the party. I mean, when has losing become okay? As Caroline pointed out, 2018 a disaster, 2020 to lose the presidency, 2022, here we go, a dramatic underperformance, largely because of Donald Trump's unhelpful interventions. So the party needs to get its head straight about winning. Parties are there designed for one reason, to win elections. And until the Republican National Committee, the state committees and others determine that their role is to elect the most, better candidates and not just be loyal to a deeply flawed individual whose company was just, was convicted today for criminal tax fraud, until they realize their job is, to nominate really good quality candidates and not, pledge allegiance to this flawed man, we're going to continue down this road. So when does winning become the primary consideration for the party? They got to get back to that. They're not there. Right. They've lost their way. And it's top to bottom.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and it's something that Mitch McConnell saw on the wall, the writing on the wall a long time ago. I think your point about the fact that better people didn't run because of Donald Trump is a very important one, and also the fact that he's got the loser label now, I think matters a lot for the 2024 race upcoming. Charlie Dent, Caroline Heldman, thank you both very much for being up late with us tonight. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And still to come here, is Georgia now a true purple battleground state? A closer look at the political fault lines. Welcome back. Democrats will have more leverage in the U.S. Senate next year now that Raphael Warnock has won re-election in the tight Georgia runoff. During his victory speech, Warnock spoke about his Georgia roots, voting rights, and bipartisanship, adding that for those who don't always agree with him, that's fine. Our tent is big. Let's bring in political analyst and author Michael Genovese. He joins me live from Los Angeles. Michael, thank you so much. I'm glad it's not quite so late there on the left coast of America. We really appreciate you being with us tonight. You study this stuff for a living. You watch how these things evolve. We've been debating at this table why it is that Georgia has been moving the way that it has. What does the outcome say to you?
You know, I don't think we should read too much into the Georgia outcome. If you look 2 years back in 2020, Donald Trump gave the Democrats a victory in Georgia by saying, you know, don't vote in the early voting. It's a fraud. Everything is a mess. And so he just depressed the Republican vote in 2020. Did the same thing in 2022 in a different way by endorsing and pushing for Herschel Walker, a deeply, deeply flawed candidate. I mean, to say that Herschel Walker was a flawed candidate is like saying that the Atlantic Ocean is moist. And so Donald Trump gave Georgia to the Democrats. And so I don't think we should read a lot into it. The two parties are so close numerically, so divided ideologically. I don't see anything that's going to break that logjam in the next 2 years.
What is your, I absolutely take your point. And if you look at, we were talking about this too, that people didn't throw very many incumbents out. The numbers in the Senate and in the House are incredibly close. Yes, the House changed hands, but it's by basically the same margin from Democrat to Republican, and a very small one at that. But this election did seem to underscore, and I've talked to a lot of sources who run campaigns who've said, you know what, we thought the median voter, the voter that's kind of in the middle, doesn't exist or doesn't matter. And that actually is not true based on what we saw in these midterm elections, that the candidates who didn't embrace the extremes, but who tried to embrace independence, swing voters, talk to a more broad constituency, were the ones who won. Do you agree with that? I mean, how do you square the polarization in the ideology that's being demonstrated on the one hand with the fact that these voters are still the ones that seem to be deciding our elections?
You're right. Electoral success means getting those people in the middle on your side. Many of them are independents, soft Democrats, soft Republicans. And that's been the case for decades. It's not going to change very much. As the parties have split more and more, you've got more Democrats who are rigidly voting for Democrats, more Republicans rigidly voting for Republicans. But that leaves a chunk of voters in the middle. And the contest in many, many states, and I think nationally in the 2024 race, is going to be who wins over those people who are not strongly committed ideologically, not strongly partisan. There are a chunk of voters, and since the parties are so evenly divided, they'll make the difference.
All right, Michael Genovese, thank you very much for being with us tonight. We really appreciate you bringing your insights to us.
Thank you.
All right. I'll be back with much more on the Georgia Senate runoff at the top of the hour. But first, John Valls picks up our top international headlines right after the break.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Valls. Our coverage of the Georgia Senate runoff election continues in a moment. But first, the latest on the war in Ukraine. And just as Ukraine appears to have developed a long-range attack drone, it seems Russia has exhausted its supply of Iranian-made combat drones. In the early morning hours Tuesday, thick black smoke could be seen above a Russian airfield about 60 miles from the Ukrainian border. Russian officials say a drone strike set fuel storage tanks on fire. Officially, there was no comment from Ukraine, but this would appear to be the third attack in 2 days on military bases inside Russia. These drone strikes on Russian soil come amid a months-long Russian air offensive on Ukraine's power grid, which has caused widespread blackouts. During a press briefing Tuesday, the U.S. Secretary of State was asked if the Ukrainian strikes were morally justified.
We have neither encouraged nor enabled the Ukrainians to strike inside of Russia, but the important thing is to understand what Ukrainians are living through every day with the ongoing Russian aggression against their country, and our determination to make sure that they have in their hands, along with many other partners around the world, the equipment that they need to defend themselves, to defend their territory, to defend their freedom.
And what appears to be yet another setback for Moscow, Western officials say Russia has exhausted its supply of Iranian-made attack drones. Officials in Washington and Kyiv have noted the Shahed 136 in particular has not been used by the Russians for the past 2 weeks. Argentina's vice president has been sentenced to 6 years in prison on corruption charges. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was found guilty of fraudulent administration after awarding a public road works contract to a family friend for personal benefit. Along with jail time, the vice president has been disqualified from holding public office again. Fernandez lashed out at the verdict, calling it judicial mafia. I'm John Vors at the CNN Centre. Casey Hunt will be back with more of our special election coverage right after this.
Hello and welcome to our viewers joining us here in the United States and all over the world. Live from Washington, I'm Casey Hunt. We are following big news for Democrats, the re-election of U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock. CNN projects the Georgia incumbent will defeat his Republican challenger, first-time political candidate Herschel Walker. Warnock's victory in this runoff election gives Democrats a 51-49 edge in the Senate. But it is a critical advantage, as Democrats will now have a majority in all of the Senate committees. Here is a part of Senator Warnock's victory speech.
I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart, and to God be the glory. After a hard-fought campaign, or should I say campaigns? It is my honor to utter the four most powerful words ever spoken in a democracy. The people have spoken.
And Herschel Walker, his challenger, was quick to concede after Warnock's projected victory. Shouldn't be noteworthy, but it is. He told supporters he believes in the Constitution and elected officials.
When they called the race, I said the numbers doesn't look like they're going to add up. But one of the things I want to tell all of you is you never stop dreaming. I don't want any of you to stop dreaming. I don't want any of you to stop believing in America. There's no excuses in life. And I'm not going to make any excuses now because we put up one heck of a fight.
Let's bring in CNN's John Berman, who's at the Magic Wall up in New York, to walk us through Senator Warnock's path to victory. First of all, John, it's to see you. Thank you for being here at this middle of the night hour on the East Coast. Let's talk about how Warnock won this election tonight.
Yeah, very nice to see you, Casey, along with Doug Flutie, introducing Herschel Walker at his concession speech last night. The first thing I want to point out, Casey, is the margin. Raphael Warnock, the margin right now, ahead by 91,000 votes. Obviously, that is more than the general election 1 month ago, where Raphael Warnock had an edge of 37,000 votes. So right now, Walker ahead by 91,000. That could still grow as more votes trickle in. One thing I want to point out, that 91,000 vote margin is basically exactly the same from his special election runoff 2 years ago. And in fact, the map that Warnock won the special election runoff 2 years ago, exactly the same as today. Look at all these counties. These are the counties Warnock won this time, exactly the same as the runoff 2 years ago. Now, where did the race get decided this time? This is interesting. Let me show you where Herschel Walker underperformed, okay? He underperformed Herschel Walker did, you can see obviously importantly in the Atlanta area. I'll dig into that in just a moment, but also the other urban and suburban areas around Columbus, Augusta, Savannah. Herschel Walker did fine. In fact, he outperformed some of his general election results in rural counties. Let me just show you a few. Dade County, Herschel Walker got 82% this time. In the general election 1 month ago, he got 80%. He actually grew that margin. Next door in Walker County, Herschel Walker in Walker County got just about 80% this time. 1 month ago, it was 77%. So he actually grew some of the margins in the rural areas. But it wasn't nearly enough because there aren't nearly enough votes there to counter what happened in the urban and suburban areas. Take Fulton County, which is the heart of Atlanta here. You can see Raphael Warnock with 76.5%, Herschel Walker 23.5%. 1 month ago, you can see it was less than that. Walker at 73%. He went from 73% to 76.5%. And there are so many more votes here. You're dealing with tens and tens of thousands of votes. So Warnock cleaned up in these urban and suburban areas. And there's one fascinating trend I want to point out to you, Casey, and I think you'll appreciate this as a student of history. And it really gets to what is a challenge for Republicans nationwide in the Trump area. Let's look at Gwinnett County. Gwinnett County is Atlanta, but also Atlanta suburbs right now. You can see Senator Raphael Warnock won Gwinnett County by 25 points. I'm going to put plus 25 here. Now go back to the presidential election in 2020. You can see Gwinnett County, Joe Biden won Gwinnett County, but it was by 18 points. Now let's go back to Hillary Clinton in 2016. Hillary Clinton won, but it was by 6 points. Raphael Warnock just won Gwinnett by 25 points. Now I'm going to blow your mind. Let's go back to 2012. And here, Mitt Romney actually won Gwinnett County by almost 9 points. Again, suburban Atlanta, Romney won by 9 points. This time, Raphael Warnock won by 25 points. So you can see that's a challenge as you look at Republicans now facing some of these areas nationwide, Casey.
No, it's an absolute great point. Mitch McConnell and his team are obsessed with the voters that are making those very changes that you just outlined, and it's likely why Democrats currently control the Senate. John Berman, thank you very much, my friend. We'll see you in an hour. I really appreciate you being here. Here to talk about the Georgia Senate runoff is our distinguished panel of guests. Paul Begala, Democratic strategist and CNN political commentator. Alice Stewart, Republican strategist and CNN political commentator. Laura Barone-Lopez is a White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. And April Ryan, a White House correspondent for the GRIO. They are both CNN political analysts. We also want to bring into the conversation CNN senior political analyst Ron Brownstein, who joins us live from Los Angeles. Ron, we're all jealous. It's a couple hours earlier where you are.
Exactly.
Early on Wednesday morning here on the East Coast. But let me start with you because, I mean, for viewers who, and we've got a lot of people watching from around the world because we're also on CNN tonight, who aren't familiar with your amazing work. I mean, you have looked at these kinds of demographic trends, the way our politics has evolved over the decades in a really in-depth and detailed way. And Georgia is such an interesting example. I mean, what do you think here? Help us understand how much of this is a fundamental shift or a demographic shift versus these individual candidates themselves and, of course, the elephant in the room, Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, look, every election is a intersection of long-term and near-term factors. So all of those figured in. But to go back to the point that John Berman finished on, what we are really seeing is the impact of the conscious choice Republicans have made in the Trump era to reorient the party toward the cultural preferences and grievances of a predominantly white, non-urban, non-college, often evangelical electorate, and the impact that has had on suburban areas that once reliably voted Republican. I mean, there were 5 states, Casey, as you know, that decided the 2020 election by shifting from Trump in 16 to Biden in 20. They were Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. With Walker's loss tonight, Republicans have lost, all 7 Republicans in those states who were nominated for governor or senator with Trump's specific endorsement have now lost. And they've lost in a very consistent way by having the suburban areas move sharply against them. It wasn't just Gwinnett and Cobb, it was Oakland and Michigan, Delaware and Montgomery in Pennsylvania, Maricopa in Arizona, and Dane County in Wisconsin. So there's a consistent pattern here of these big, populous, thriving population centers in the metro areas rejecting the Trump-era definition of the party, and their increased strength in the rural areas not being quite enough to overcome that.
Yeah, no, it's such a good point. And Alice Stewart, I mean, I got to, as the Republican at the table, bring you in here because the reality is the people are increasingly in cities and suburbs. And the party is increasingly, as Ron very clearly laid out, focusing on a message that appeals to rural voters. And there are simply not enough of them to win national elections. And, you know, we're seeing it in control of the Senate. There's obviously very narrow control of the House on the Republican side. Almost not enough that I'm not even sure exactly what we can take away from the way the House switched this year. But, I mean, how can Republicans win back these voters that they need to win if they want the White House back?
Well, they can start with nominating quality candidates. Candidate quality was the big factor in a lot of these races that Ron mentioned that we lost. People that were flawed candidates that were backed by Trump, election deniers, were okay with the January 6th, the insurrection at the Capitol. That did not sit well with voters. So getting quality candidates that focus on issues that are important to voters is really important. And this, I think, will go a long way to what I'm going to say next. Ronna McDaniel, chairwoman of the Republican National Committee, she was put in that position in 2017. Since she has been in that position, Republicans have not won across the board in any races since she has been in office. I think change starts at the top. In order for Republicans to do well moving forward, change needs to begin at the top, and therefore, someone like her in a position of head of the RNC, get candidates in the primary process that can win in the general election. This is not just about winning primaries, it's about winning the general election.
I take your point, but at the end of the day, and Paul Begala, I'm interested in your take on this. The end of the day, a big part of this is that the best people in the Republican Party haven't wanted to put themselves in positions to run for these offices, to run for Senate. I mean, we had Chris Sununu in New Hampshire. There were others kind of across the map that Mitch McConnell really wanted to run and who didn't run because nobody wanted anything to do with Trump. I mean, how do they solve that problem?
We're not talking about the Maryland Senate race because the incumbent won in a landslide Democrat because Larry Hogan, the incredibly popular Republican governor of one of the most Democratic states, didn't want anything to do with politics in the time of Trump in the U.S. Senate.
I mean, he's going to run for president, but yes.
Well, and we wish him well. But I think the problem is not even just geographic, right? They do have a problem in the cities and in the suburbs, but it's what they say. You know, right after the Civil War, Henry Adams, a historian and writer and diplomat, he described American politics in his day as the systematic organization of hatreds. That's Donald Trump's politics. If he were going to rural America and say, I'm going to help save rural hospitals, you know, 1/3 of all the rural hospitals in America are under risk of closing. That's a crisis. There's a crisis on the farm. God knows there's an opioid crisis in every part of America, but it's hitting rural America hard. If he were going to them with ideas and solutions for their very real problems, that'd be one thing. Instead, he's going with grievance. Look at Mr. Walker running ads attacking trans kids, of which I think in high school athletics in Georgia there are 2. And we know that trans kids have spectacularly higher suicide ideations and self-harm. And that's just, it has failed politically, but I also think morally it's wrong. It's better to come to voters with something you'll do for them than just, I hate the same people you hate.
All right, let's press pause on this. We're going to come back to our great panel in just a second because CNN's special coverage of the Georgia Senate runoff continues after this quick break.
You got me for 6 more years.
That was U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock celebrating his major win in the final race of the 2022 midterm elections. CNN projects he'll defeat Republican challenger Herschel Walker in that very close runoff election. Neither candidate got above 50% of the vote in November's general election, which is what sparked this runoff. Warnock's victory gives Democrats a 51 to 49 seat majority in the U.S. Senate, and it brings to an end the marathon midterm election cycle that we are still covering, which saw Democrats defy historical trends, limiting their losses in the House and tonight gaining a seat in the Senate. But CNN political analyst Van Jones pointed out tonight that Senator Warnock's victory, in his view, wasn't big enough.
Just because Republicans have done dumb stuff doesn't make Democrats smart. And there is a danger that we get too triumphalist about what just happened. He should have been beat by 50 points. He should have been beat by 80 points. There are problems and faults and flaws in our party. I want to make sure that we fix those because 2024 is around the corner.
All right, let's talk about this more with our esteemed panel. And April and Lauren, let me bring you into this conversation. I'm not sure I agree with Van entirely, considering the state of our politics. This was always going to be close. The reality is that Warnock, Laura, actually, I mean, we keep calling it a close race. Yes, almost every race in a competitive state in American politics right now is close. But this margin was pretty significant for a state that is a swing state at the end of the day.
It was, and it still is Georgia. And I know we were just talking about all of the shifting demographics in Georgia, but it still just became a swing state in 2020. So because of that, I think that there are a lot of things that Democrats can learn from this election cycle and carry on into 2024. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about yet is abortion. And when I was down there in Georgia, yes, it was the runoff, but a lot of female voters that I was talking to mentioned abortion access and mentioned that issue. And so I think that that is going to be something that, especially as we potentially see in 24, a number of states bring up abortion access ballot measures that Democrats could potentially use, which they did in a number of states this cycle, to try to bolster turnout.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, April, that some of my sources said, too, is that abortion was one of the reasons why perhaps history was defied in this election cycle, meaning that there were a lot of voters who looked at, you know, normally they say, oh, the party's in power, you know, we're going to say we want to check on them or we want to change things around a little bit. Because of the way the Supreme Court intervened so aggressively, instead, voters actually felt like Republicans needed a check in this sort of different way. What's your view?
Most definitely. When you have a conservative court that's going to overturn the law of the land, I mean, the nation came out saying that they didn't want to change Roe v. Wade, and the Supreme Court did that. And then you have a candidate who has accusations about him paying money to a former girlfriend with a get well card. That, you know, he's denying having an abortion, and his son comes out saying you're lying. That brought a whole nother layer and conundrum on this very sensitive issue in the nation. Do you believe this candidate? Where does he stand on issues? And can you trust what he says? And it goes back kind of sort of also to what Charlie Dent said earlier about the fact that he was not a good candidate. He was someone who he couldn't string sentences together.
There were a lot of questions, vampires, werewolves, etc. Yes.
Among other things. And but issues matter in a state that's trying to figure out who it is and a party that's trying to figure out who it is.
So Ron Brownstein, I mean, as we think about this kind of in the big picture, this really was the midterm, the whole midterm, not just what happened in Georgia, but it was not necessarily the kind of change wave election that we saw kind of swing the country back and forth in previous midterm elections like 2006 and 2010. Instead, most incumbents won their elections. The House did not swing very far. I mean, yes, Kevin McCarthy's party is going to be in charge of the House, but it's by, you know, barely, and kind of by basically the same majority that Nancy Pelosi held, you know, 4 or 5 seats or so. And then you have the Senate, again, basically evenly split. They hand the Democrats 1 seat. I mean, what do you think it is that drove this sort of maintenance of the status quo almost in this election cycle?
You know, what I wrote in mid-October, Casey, was I thought that it was becoming a double negative election. And I think that produced the environment that gave us that result. On the one hand, you had a majority of voters who were negative on Biden's performance and negative on the state of the economy. In fact, in the exit polls, you know, we saw that borne out. And normally that would produce big gains for the party out of power. But that first negative was, I think, curtailed and limited by the second negative, which was that there was a substantial number of voters who viewed the Trump-era Republican Party as a threat to their rights and to democracy itself on abortion and other issues, and that they were reluctant to entrust them with power despite their doubts about the Democrats. And, that led to this extraordinary set of results, which included Democrats narrowly winning independents in the national exit poll. No party holding the White House has won independents in a midterm since at least 1982. And Democrats, of course, won them by even bigger margins in the swing states. And the other thing I think that's really important to recognize, though, is that this really was two different elections in the blue and swing states than it was in the red states. Because, in Michigan and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, in states where Colorado, Washington, in states where abortion is still legal, there was a clear and unmistakable signal from voters that they wanted it to remain legal. And you saw overwhelming percentages of voters who identified as pro-choice voting for Democrats. On the other hand, in the red states that have actually banned abortion, like Florida and Texas, even Georgia, Iowa, with the sole exception of Arizona, we didn't really see much of a backlash. So in some ways, what this election did was deepen and widen the chasm between red America and blue America. The challenge for Republicans is that when you look at the Electoral College, the states that lean Democratic really leave them, I think, with an uphill climb for 2024, unless they can change the dynamic in these suburban communities that we were talking about.
This is why we love talking to you, Ron. Really fascinating analysis, and looking forward. There are just huge implications, as you point out. Our panel's going to stick around with us for the next hour. You all are watching CNN's special coverage of the Senate runoff in Georgia. We will be back with more on Raphael Warnock's win after this short break. U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock remains undefeated after winning a close Georgia runoff just a few hours ago. That's after neither he nor Republican challenger Herschel Walker earned the necessary 50% of the vote in the general midterm election last month, and we had to go to this runoff. But Warnock's now secured his first full 6-year term, giving Democrats a critical edge in the Senate. The White House is thankful, posting this photo of President Joe Biden calling Warnock to congratulate him. In the caption, they write, "Tonight, Georgia voters stood up for our democracy, rejected ultra-MAGA-ism, and most importantly, sent a good man back to the Senate." A short time ago, former U.S. President Barack Obama tweeted, quote, "Georgians have proven that when it comes time to vote, they'll show up and vote for a leader who will fight for them." No reaction yet from former President Donald Trump, who, of course, handpicked Herschel Walker and a series of other controversial midterm candidates who then lost their elections. The losses do reflect pretty badly on Trump, who has already launched his 2024 presidential bid. And it's been a rough day for Team Trump in other ways, with major developments in the Capitol riot probe. The January 6th House Select Committee plans to make criminal referrals to the Justice Department. The committee chairman says the panel has not yet narrowed down everyone who will be referred or what charges they might recommend. But those decisions will have to come soon, as the committee is set to wrap up its probe and publish a final report by the end of the year. Time's running out because Republicans are set to take control of the House and sure to disband the committee. There's also this. A New York jury has found 2 Trump Organization's companies guilty of multiple counts of tax fraud. The case was over a 15-year scheme carried out by top executives who kept lavish perks and bonuses off of the books. A high-ranking executive pleaded guilty to 15 different felony charges, admitting that he failed to pay taxes on nearly $2 million of income. It comes as Donald Trump is pursuing the Republican nomination for president yet again. And while he and his family were not charged directly in the case, the verdict could have further impacts on their businesses. Attorneys for the Trump Organization say that they will appeal. Our panel is back with us. We've got Paul Begala, Democratic strategist, Alice Stewart, Republican strategist, both CNN political commentators. We've also got April Ryan and Laura Barone Lopez. Laura is the White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. April for the Grio, both CNN political analysts. I think we also have Ron Brownstein still with us, senior political analyst from Los Angeles. This has been a conversation, guys, that we here on set have been having in the breaks and around, throughout the past couple of hours. And Paul, I got to tell you, the thing about Trump, and I have been convinced for many months that if he were going to get in, it was going to be a situation where, I mean, he was going to be the man to beat. He was probably the most likely future Republican nominee. It does seem to me that there has been a shift. I mean, yes, part of it's the elections, part of it is Republicans who were, willing to say privately for a very long time that they thought Trump was a loser are now more willing to say it in public, fine. But also the things that the president himself has been doing have seemed farther afield in a way. I mean, whether it's the dinner with Kanye West and the, Holocaust denier, who I don't even want to name, or the tweet, the truth? What do we call things on Truth Social? That came out where he says that we should terminate the Constitution. I mean, the degree to which, I'm not sure I thought the absurdity could get even worse than it was, but somehow it has. And in some ways, it does seem to me like it is less likely that he is going to be taken seriously as the next nominee. But I don't know. What do you think?
I think he will be, and I think he will be the nominee. And I'm often wrong. It's not my party. Alice probably knows better. But Republicans have this winner-take-all system, which favors a plurality candidate. And while Trump does these things that are so offensive to even many Republicans, they make him beloved to a core of maybe 25, 35% of Republicans. And as long as he has them, and you have a vast field, keep in mind when he ran the first time in 2016, he didn't win a majority in any primary or caucus until the 33rd state, New York, his home state. So
yes, that is true.
He never had 50% support even a single day as president. He never beat a Democrat once by getting more votes. So he is a plurality candidate, and that's where he's comfortable. So he's going to keep doubling and tripling down, but I wouldn't bet against that in a multi-candidate field.
Sure, but Alice, go ahead.
I will say there's a little bit of difference. I'll beg to differ with my friend Paul with regard to now in 2016. 2016, a lot of us held our noses and got behind him. He went into the White House with very low expectations, and he failed to deliver. But we gave him the benefit of the doubt. He came in with low expectations, but gave him the benefit of the doubt. 6 years later, he failed to deliver. We now have the benefit of options. There are other Republicans that are going to come forward and stand up to him. It might be a fractured field to begin with, but between these legal challenges, January 6th, the constitutional comments, the dinners with anti-Semites, people are saying it is time to turn the page. He is becoming increasingly irrelevant in the Republican Party day after day, and Republicans are saying it's time to move on.
Let me get Ron to weigh in here because, look, I mean, what Paul's saying is if you're a plurality candidate in a winner-take-all situation, he can, get his 20% in Iowa and New Hampshire, and if there's not another candidate who can best that, then we're going to see that fragmented field. He can potentially clear it through. Based on what you saw in Florida from Ron DeSantis, do you think that that's likely to happen again? Or, I mean, what is your view of what we've been talking about?
No, I think Paul is right that is Trump's biggest asset is the Republican rules favor whoever has the biggest piece, even if that piece is smaller than a majority. And as he points out, he was already the presumptive nominee in 2016 before he had reached 50% of the vote in any state. What happened in 2016 was that Trump consolidated the half of the party who are non-college Republicans, many of them evangelicals, much more than anyone else consolidated the other half of the party, who are college-educated Republicans. At the point that he had effectively ended the race in 2016, Casey, he was still winning only about a third of college-educated Republicans. So in that sense, he's not in that different a position right now, where you see in polling only about a third of college-educated Republicans say they want him again or say they would support him. The question is whether anyone can consolidate that piece of the party more effectively than Kasich, Rubio, Cruz, et al. Did in 2016. And I think that will be the biggest question. One thing I'm trying to puzzle out of my head, I'm not sure I have an answer yet, maybe Alice does. If you think about most of the candidates who could get into this race, I think more of them are more oriented toward that college side than the blue-collar side that really helped Trump. If you think of Hogan or Youngkin or Pompeo, so it may be that the field faces the same problem. Not only a lot of candidates, but a lot of candidates fishing primarily in the pool other than the one that Trump is going to be strongest in.
Yeah, I mean, and Laura, this does seem like the central challenge because, I mean, how many times has Trump been declared politically dead only to end up being the primary, and again, the primary force in a Republican nominating contest. We already know, and we've got so much evidence that we've been talking about all night that shows that he cannot win general elections anymore based on his time in the White House and other issues. But when it comes to winning Republican primaries, they are in this position. And all these other candidates, to Ron's point, would potentially split up the other types of Republican voters.
Right, and as we talk about whether or not Republicans are saying collectively we want to turn a page, one thing that I think is important here is that when reporters were asking Republicans after the meeting with Kanye West and the white supremacist Nick Fuentes whether or not they would condemn it, a number of Republicans eventually came out and said that they condemned it, but they still wouldn't say that it was disqualifying or that they weren't going to support Trump. The same thing with the latest Truth Social tweet from Trump where he says we should terminate the Constitution. Republicans again said, I don't agree with that. That's not okay. We defend the Constitution. But then you go the step further of, okay, are you done with the former president? Are you going to not support him? And they do not take that step. And McConnell, you know, the Senate Minority Leader, has said before that he would potentially support Trump if he were the nominee again. So this idea that Republicans are going to totally sever their ties with him, I think, is just, I don't think it's going to happen.
April, brief last word.
Brief last word. The elephant in the room that no one's talking about is that he's going into this weekend, but if there is an indictment, he could wind up being a martyr, and that he could rally the base and rally Republicans yet again to become the nominee. That's my take.
Oh boy! All right,
but it's true. It's real.
No, we're not. But I do not disagree with you, and I do not disagree with you at all. All right, in the run-up to the runoff, Georgia's single-day early voting record was repeatedly broken. We're going to look at how voter turnout impacted the results.